China on the rise in the Arab world. After the 10th meeting of the China-Arab States Cooperation Forum, is Beijing supplanting the U.S. and Europe in influence, pitching itself as an honest broker in Israel's war on Gaza, as well as a partner in trade and investment? Will China's modus of outreach and non-interference take hold in Arabic-speaking states? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's Newsmaker is China in the Arab world. Now, the world has been observing the rise of China as a global power for decades now, often with both admiration and apprehension. Last month, Beijing convened another China-Arab summit that highlighted its working partnership with Arab states, some of which the West has long fallen out with. China sees those relationships as proof that its non-interference policy is a win-win for nations looking for investment and trade, but not in determining their own domestic and foreign policy. Here's a look now at how China is approaching the Arab world.
Within 11 years, China's economy is expected to overtake the US as the biggest in the world, and its growing global clout is increasingly being felt in all corners of the world. In its latest diplomatic push, Beijing recently hosted the China-Arab States Cooperation Forum, where leaders and foreign ministers from the 22 Arab League states gathered to meet President Xi Jinping. Discussions focused on economic cooperation, but also delved into critical issues from counter-terrorism to the climate crisis and human rights. And the leaders' statements highlighted just how much progress is being made between China and Arab states.
Before the establishment of the forum, the volume of trade didn't exceed $36 billion a year. Last year, 2023, it was $400 billion. So 10 times, more than 10 times doubled. So the significance of that forum is very much noticed.
China's approach to Palestine also won praise from the Arab world. Beijing pledged significant humanitarian aid to Gaza and has repeatedly urged Israel to declare a ceasefire.
I would like to thank China for supporting the just cause of Palestine and the Palestinian people. We are seeing that the Palestinian issue is now being more clearly explained worldwide, with its historical context being revealed, including the suffering endured by the Palestinian people over the past 60 to 70 years.
The forum's host, President Xi Jinping, emphasized the historic ties and mutual benefit for both sides.
As an Arab saying goes, friends are the sunshine in life. I always find it heartwarming to meet Arab friends. The friendship between the Chinese and Arab peoples is deeply rooted in our friendly exchanges along the ancient Silk Road, in our joint struggles for national liberation, and in our win-win cooperation in promoting national development.
China's growing influence now reaches far beyond its borders, with strategic investments in different parts of the world, from the Pacific to Africa and the Middle East. Key investments in Sri Lankan and Pakistani ports underline China's strategic maritime ambitions, previously dominated by India in regions such as the Maldives. And across Latin America, major infrastructure projects bear the hallmark of Chinese investment, driving growth but also sparking debate about influence and sovereignty. And China's rapid rise is not greeted with applause from all over the world. The US, whose imports of Chinese products help fuel China's phenomenal economic growth, is increasingly placing tariffs and restrictions on the flow of Chinese goods. And the two superpowers are also at odds over China's stated aim to bring democratic Taiwan back under its control. But as China forges ever closer ties with the global community, the gradual shift in the balance of power appears to be moving inexorably eastwards.
So while the U.S. is looking to prevent Chinese growth, at least in its own market, other nations, including Arab states, have plans to increase cooperation. So will China replace the U.S. and Europe in their influence and economic power in the Arab world? Well, joining me now to debate that and more are from Beijing, political and economic affairs commentator Einar Tangen. From Washington, professor at the National Defense University, Des Roches. And from Manama, Bahrain, senior fellow for Middle East policy at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, Hasan Alhasan. Thanks all so much for being with me. Hasan, I'll start with you. Tell us how you think Arab states actually view China. Is there, some enthusiasm, at least among some, to be able to break away economically from powers like the U.S. or in the case of North and West Africa, from France, with China as kind of the new power alternative?
So I think these dynamics that you describe have been in motion for quite some time, in the sense that China already looms very large in economic terms. It has been the largest trading partner for the Arab Gulf states as a bloc for quite some time. And as a region, it already, I think, overshadows most other great powers, including the United States and the EU, as a trading partner yet again. And of course, in energy terms, China is obviously the largest energy oil export market for most Arab oil exporters. So in economic terms, I think China has already very much claimed its place as the top economic power that countries in the region look to. The Belt and Road Initiative, the very large infrastructure building initiative that China rolled out several years ago, and that came with promises of investments and financing of much needed infrastructure, has also been seen with great interest and appetite by countries in the region. And a lot of the countries, including capital-rich Arab Gulf states, have linked their own economic visions to the Belt and Road Initiative. And obviously countries that lack capital, including in North Africa and the Levant, have also been very interested in attracting Chinese financing and investing. And so I think China is seen as a development partner. It already has multiple development initiatives in Egypt, in Iraq, and elsewhere. From a trading perspective, it's obviously very significant. And so I think that economic relationship definitely stands on its own feet. The interesting thing is that China, especially with its specific partners like the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt, are now, I think, taking relations beyond traditional trading links. And so obviously China is an investor in those countries. Amid China's economic downturn, Chinese investors are looking to move manufacturing operations in places like Egypt, where they are geographically closer to Europe, where they can essentially get labor for cheaper. They're looking at widening and opening up new consumer markets in the Gulf. And you also see an interest among Chinese asset managers, whether private or sovereign.
Okay.
And so we're really seeing an appetite for investments, and even potentially, the linking of stock exchanges. There is experimentation with central bank digital currencies between the UAE and China, looking at alternative ways to settle trade transactions.
Right. And on that, Einar, as you will know, there has been a lot of buzz around, China and its partners in trade and finance to kind of break away from this dollar hegemony that they see. And that came up a lot when we witnessed the meeting, especially on business channels, witnessed the meeting at the end of May with China and its Arab partners. Where do you see that going?
Well, Andrea, I mean, here's the problem. It's not that anybody wanted to break away from the dollar. It's just that when the U.S. weaponized it against Iran, Venezuela, Russia, of course, and this latest move where they're going to actually seize assets held in, U.S. banks or under U.S. control or through entities that they are able to control. This has made a lot of sovereign countries extremely nervous. And you can see that. This is not about China and the U.S. This is about the entire world. The lowest amount of central bank holdings of treasuries since 2011. I mean, people are very concerned. As soon as that interest rate drops in terms of the Fed, whenever that happens, you're going to see a large outflow if there are better rates somewhere else. These kind of hot money flows. And the problem is the U.S. deficit continues to grow. It's expected to grow between $1.6 and $1.8 trillion on top of the $34 trillion. That represents most of the interest, I mean, all of the interest plus that is due on these particular bonds. I mean, if it was any other country but the U.S., they'd say it was a Ponzi scheme. So this idea that countries are moving away politically from the U.S. is nonsense. It has to do with the practicalities. They're concerned that they're going to be holding a lot of dollars that aren't going to be worth much if there's a run on dollars and a de-dollarization.
Okay. David, did I see you flinch there for a second, or do you agree that? Go ahead.
Well, the deficit is of concern, and there are perhaps some financial considerations. But look, the reason why people go to the dollars and the U.S. dominant, I used to work money laundering in the 1990s when we first started applying sanctions and stuff. And we were told then that all of Latin America would move away from the dollar. But what we've seen is that there are basically trade away from the dollar is essentially barter trade. And the reason for that is because if you move to any alternate currency, what you have is an authoritarian state that doesn't have a legal process that you can pursue and adjudicate claims against the government. Yeah, try suing the government where you live, Einar, and see how many laughs you get out of that. So what you'll find is that Chinese companies, Russian companies, people investing their own money will not entrust their investment to courts in China, in Russia, in Venezuela, in Cuba, in Iran. What you'll find is that ultimately what guarantees the dollar, and to a lesser extent the European currencies, is the fact that you have arbitration, which is still viewed as neutral. And so when people invest their own money, not talking about state-directed firms, they make that choice. Now, inflation is a concern, the deficit is a concern, and there will be some issues on the margins. But if you look at the trend, in spite of almost 2 decades of concerned complaining about weaponization of the dollar and the other arguments that we heard from Einar, what you'll find is that the trade has only marginally moved into other currencies. So it really is a political consideration.
That is not true. I mean, what period of time are you looking at? What do you mean marginal? Are you saying 20% is marginal? Come on.
What I'm saying,
talk points from the State Department are wonderful, but I don't think that necessarily repeating them is going to earn you any credibility.
I don't think I've spoken to anybody. Oh, come on. I have not spoken to anybody at the State Department. Look, I leave it to the readers. Well, take a look at how much of the world trade is in dollars now. Take a look at how much of the world trade was in dollars 20 years ago and evaluate it for yourself.
Exactly.
And Einar, I got to tell you.
You've seen a massive decrease in that. So I don't think it's marginal.
Shall we? Okay.
It's interesting.
I'll leave it to the readers.
Yeah.
I'll lead it to the readers.
Okay, but they're watching, so it's more important that they watch.
But overall, I think we should have another entire program on the question of where the dollar is going. What's the end game? If there ever really is a realistic outcome for the replacement of the dollar eventually. But for right now, let's keep our focus more on the Arab world. Wait, David, before I leave you, I wanted to ask, because having said everything that you've said and that we've heard from our other panelists, you've said the bottom line, though, is that China still does not want to end up being the global superpower. A global power, yes, but China is very comfortable not having to take that proverbial lead. Let's put it that way. Why so?
Well, because they're smart. I mean, look, the United States, as Hasan noted, the United States is not the major trading partner in the Gulf and doesn't benefit from the Gulf energy trade. In particular, China does. But most of the security burden of the Gulf, most of the military presence that makes that trade go is American. So China basically gets a benefit that they don't pay for. I think China's vision is what they want is to have a sphere of influence in East Asia, where they are the dominant power, where another state cannot, like Korea, for example, cannot develop an independent defense or foreign policy, cannot sail a ship through the Taiwan Strait without China say so. But they don't want to be a global hegemon in the political or military sense, because they figure that they can achieve their goals economically, which is pretty smart. And there is an isolationist strain in America which says, we should probably move along those lines as well.
Interesting. Hasan, let me come back to you because I'd like to explore this, and there has been plenty of commentary on China's role in the Middle East, especially as a moderator in the war on Gaza. We know China hosted unity talks, they were called, between Hamas and Fatah. Not a lot came out of it, but still, did it serve to show in the Arab world that China can be this kind of honest, uninvested broker that nations can rely on in times of conflict?
So I think we have to remember that China's interest in the Palestinian issue predates the war that has erupted in October 7. China, around more than a decade ago, had appointed a special envoy to the Middle East, who was mandated to a very large extent with looking at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And China has come up in previous conflicts between Hamas and Israel with various proposals and plans to essentially resolve this long-standing dispute, albeit without much traction or success. Interestingly, in the current context, in the context of the current conflict, China has played an interesting role. I think it's been wanting to increase and expand its role as mediator, as peacemaker, following a successful pushing or accompanying of the Saudi-Iran normalization agreement, pushing it beyond the finish line after years of Iraqi and Omani mediation. But nevertheless, I think that was a success that China could claim for itself. And I think that created a bit of momentum. And we saw China actually play quite an interesting role at the ICJ, at the International Court of Justice, where they even defended the Palestinians' right to armed resistance against Israel, which is a position that you don't see many other non-Arab great powers essentially put forward. And so I think China sees a role to point to US double standards comparing Ukraine and Gaza. They see a very clear opportunity to play the role of peacemaker to gain wider sympathy in the Arab world and in the global South at really minimal cost for Beijing,
Right.
Because Beijing, can do this diplomatically through the UN.
It's interesting, Hasan,
international
that you did mention Iran there, because China is in a very unique position in being able to manage a good relationship with Iran, but manage a good relationship with some of Iran's adversaries. It's almost like China is kind of an assertive version of Switzerland, that it can somehow maintain a sort of neutrality while dealing with all parties. That's unique.
That's true, but it's not unique to China in the sense that India also has the exact same set of relationships in the region, and the opposite is or the obverse is also true, meaning that the Arab states also have good relations with the U.S., with Russia, with China, with Pakistan, and with India. And so I think it's an ethos of decoupling where states will conduct relations bilaterally without necessarily conforming to any overarching logic of blocs. Now, China has good relations with almost everyone in the region. At the same time, I don't think China has a massive appetite to invest a lot of real capital behind, this role as a peacemaker, as mediator. I think it's willing to do it so long as it doesn't cost China very much, and there's a clear and easy opportunity for it to do so, but without really investing much of the financial or political, let alone military resources that would be needed to bring a lot of these things to fruition.
Okay.
I think China largely prefers to work through regional partners rather than sort of over their heads.
Okay, then Einar, let me come back to you, because we have this issue now of China facing these massive, U.S. tariffs. And many see that as a way for the U.S. to try to seek to hurt China's economy, therefore minimizing its power, at least on the margins. By costing China a lot of business in one of its biggest markets. So how much do you think China is set to suffer, for the U.S. imposing those tariffs? And can relationships, increased relationships with Arab states in the developing world compensate for some of that loss?
Well, absolutely, Andrea. I mean, what you've seen is double-digit gains in terms of the trade with the rest of the world, not Europe and America, where it continues to decline. The issue is, let's look at the world. If you take Europe and America in terms of landmass, population, manufacturing, resources, they're way in the minority. But if you take the rest of the world, They control all the rest. China alone this year is 9 times. It's the equivalent in terms of manufacturing of the next 9 countries combined. The only comparable situation is the U.S. defense budget, which is more than the next 9 countries combined. It's a guns and butter type of situation. But there's one thing I want to add here, Andrea, and that is it is a mistake to assume that China will act the same way as the U.S. China is a civilization. It tends to be very inward focused. It's concerned about managing things within its borders or what it perceives to be its borders. U.S., we have been at peace for all of 15 years in our 248 years of existence. We are an empire. We're always concerned about what we control in other places and how to get resources cheap and who we're conquering and all the treaties that we break. So it's two different scenarios. Do not assume that they're the same.
David, would you agree there? And if you can also kind of comment on what the U.S. strategy, if I can call it that, the Biden administration imposing these massive tariffs, what it thinks it will achieve in either harming China or protecting U.S. consumers. So I'm not sure it's much protection because, hybrid cars, for example, are far more affordable if they're Chinese made. And they're actually performing rather well, especially in markets like South Africa. You'll see them everywhere. Consumers are generally very pleased with their performance. Americans won't have that opportunity. They either pay for very expensive hybrids and electric vehicles, and they're going to lose out.
Yeah, well, it's first off, I agree with pretty much everything Hasan said. I agree with much of what Einar said. The only point I would highlight is Einar's point about China's borders as it perceives it, which are certainly not as China's neighbors perceive it. I think that the impetus for these tariffs is domestic. I don't think that there's any great plan to hobble. The American market alone is not big enough to decimate China's industries. I think that the concern is rather old school. Is this competitive trade or is this dumping and state subsidized trade intended to undermine the ability to do industries there? And what's really interesting about the tariffs on these things is that President Biden out of government, when President Trump had tariffs on, I think, Chinese aluminum or something, he said, oh no, tariffs are anti-competitive, they harm American markets. But then in office, President Biden's policy is similar. So I think it's more of an economic argument rather than a geopolitical argument. I think it refers to things such as government trade subsidies and production subsidies and dumping. But yeah.
Let me ask Hasan then, if Arab states potentially feel they have a bit of a consumer advantage then, because they are allowed to import some pretty decent technology at a massive discount for what their American counterparts would now have to pay because they have this better trade relationship with China. And they're not looking at, well, maybe eventually they will produce their own domestic market in automobiles, but right now they get to purchase very cost-effective, environmentally friendly cars.
Yeah, I mean, quite broadly, the US-China great power rivalry playing out in trade and technology presents various threats and opportunities to the Arab countries. I mean, when you look at the downside, so the Arab countries, for example, have been caught in the crossfire of US tariffs on steel and aluminum, which are meant to take aim at China's steel and aluminum exports. But lo and behold, it ends up adversely impacting the exports of countries like the UAE or Bahrain to the United States almost inadvertently. And so in a sense, tariffs that are taking aim at China can also obviously have adverse impacts on exports from the region. On the other hand, Chinese manufacturers seeking to circumvent US tariffs or Western tariffs even more broadly might and are beginning to look at Arab countries as potential locations where they could shift parts of their manufacturing, including Egypt, for example, not only to be geographically closer, but also to avail themselves of free trade agreements that exist between certain Arab countries and the United States. There are obviously, as you said, consumer benefits here in the Gulf. You're likely to see shifting trading patterns because of these high tariffs placed by the United States. The GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council and China are negotiating a free trade agreement. They've been doing so since 2004, but there are indications that over the past 6 months, those negotiations have picked up in pace and intensity. And if that happens, then you could see a trade facilitating effect of that agreement between China and the Gulf states. Keep in mind as well that that countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE are also often used as or could potentially be seen as places for China to try and gain access through trade to pieces or components of technology that are currently under U.S. export controls.
Okay.
And that may have and has already seemingly had an impact on the U.S., for example, placing restrictions on NVIDIA's export of chips to the region, primarily out of fear that these could then find their way to China. So broadly speaking, the great power rivalry between China and the U.S. Obviously has downsides, but also upsides for the region.
You know, so much more to talk about, but Hasan Alhasan, I let you run out the clock there because it's so interesting to hear your analysis and our other panelists as well. I really wish we had more time, but unfortunately that is it. For this edition of The Newsmakers, I'd like to thank all three of you so much for joining me. Really great to have you, and our viewers, of course, for being with us as well. Remember, you can follow us on X, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.